My name is Peter Boot. I'm working on this together with my colleague Ronald Dekker. You hear me? We're working at the Huygens Institute for Netherlands History, and one of the things that the Institute does is to create scholarly digital editions. That is careful digital online representation of historical or literary sources, often in multiple versions, often with lots of editorial commentary. And I won't need to argue in front of you that these sorts of editions need to be able to be annotated. So that's the thing that we're dealing with here. Because annotation functionality is expensive, we want a generic annotation tool that can work with multiple editions. Editions live on the web, but they're not merely collections of web pages. They're abstract information objects with their own structure. And so we want to facilitate a generic annotation tool to be able to work with that abstract structure, which is not immediately visible within the HTML. So how should a generic tool be able to know the structure of the things that it is annotating? That's really the question that we have. And we think there really is room for a protocol to handle the communication between the edition and the annotation tool. We've talked a lot about interoperability today, and interoperability can work at multiple levels. We're not so much interested here in an interoperable annotation model. What interests us in how the thing that we annotate can interoperate with the annotation tools. And we want to refer to the edition perhaps in terms of the underlying XML file, because usually there is an XML file underlying this edition, but preferably in terms of what is called a canonical citation scheme. That is the structure that people actually use to refer to parts of the text that is being edited. So for instance, the book, chapter, verse structure of the Bible, that's a typical example of the canonical citation scheme. So where does this come from? This is an example of a scholarly digital edition that we make. It's the Letters of Vincent van Gogh. And here you see immediately why annotation of web content alone is problematic. On the left, there's a text of the letter, but on the right is the same text, just in a line-by-line representation, as Van Gogh wrote it actually. And it's clear that an annotation in the context of the right panel is applicable in the context of the left panel. And there's another representation of the text, in this case a translation. You might want to annotate it as a translation, but you could also annotate it as a version of the text. And again, annotations should transfer between those versions. Sorry, I'm going the wrong way. Apart from the texts, there's also the text bearers, so the pages that are being annotated. And there's lots of editorial additions. For example, explanatory notes to the text, but also more structured annotation about a number of aspects of the text. And there's, for instance, even illustrations to the works of art that can be considered a form of editorial enrichment. And there's more which I can't go into now. I'll show you one sheet from another edition. It's an edition of the manuscript of Madame Bovary, made at the University of Rouen. And one of the interesting things here is that you see that all of the additions and deletions that Flaubert made during his writing are represented within the text. It's clear this is no longer a linear text. There's no way you can annotate it, say, by taking character 40 through 50 in this text. So what you have to begin to do is to identify the actual pieces of text that are shown here. The context that we're thinking about is this. There's an edition server that is showing an edition in a browser to a client. The annotation client runs within the browser, probably started by some JavaScript, but it has its own annotation server. And as I said, we want to facilitate communication between the edition and the annotation tool, whereby the edition says, how it's structured and what its content is. At some later stage, of course, the edition will want to know about the annotations that have been made. But for now, that's an interesting question, but it's out of scope. So what are the requirements for such a protocol? Well, the edition describes itself and its structure. It should be able to provide labels for the objects that are being annotated. It should be able to suggest annotation types that are useful in this context. But essential to us is, above all, that the effort for the edition should be minimal. That is, we're thinking about making it possible to plug in annotation functionality into existing editions. We don't want to require a certain technological setup from the edition. As I said, the annotation tool should be generic, but it should have enough information to be able to answer intelligent questions. For instance, give me all annotations aggregated at a certain hierarchical level. And to do that, it must have an idea about what that hierarchical levels look like. In general, the annotation targets should be durable. The URI should be considered opaque, so we shouldn't try to guess the structure from the structure of the URIs. And if possible, as said, the URI should be canonical. How do we think that such a protocol might look like? And I should say that to some extent, some of the ideas that we've been thinking about, we've already found in Pundit. It wasn't quite clear to what extent actually Pundit was doing all of things that we wanted to do. But our idea is we embed RDF in HTML, so we use RDFA, and what that does is it identifies the resources that are being annotated. It says of what type these resources are, and it describes the relations between the resources using RDF properties. The RDF refers to an ontology. In the ontology are described the sorts of annotatable objects that exist and the annotation types that are applicable to them. To our mind, there should be a simple and general ontology, a version that everyone can use even if they do not have the resources to create a specialized ontology for themselves. But projects that have that expertise should be able to extend the ontology and to create more specific annotatable objects and annotation types in order to have more powerful annotations. So the simple version of the ontology might look like this. Here we have just 3 types of annotatable objects. The creative work, so that's the content of the edition. The text bearers, so that's the pages where the text was written or printed on. And the enrichment, so everything that has been added by the editors in order to make this text or its history more comprehensible to the readers. An extended version for the Van Gogh site might look like this. As you see, I've here added a number of subtypes for the creative work. We now have a correspondence, an individual letter, a paragraph within a letter, and a sketch. For the editorial enrichment, I've also added a number of subtypes. The metadata item, the notes, essays, and translations, and these in turn can be subclassed, well, as you see fit, as you think there's a need to. In the HTML, this might look like this. We see a body element, and that says that this HTML page is about a certain letter. We see here well, it's not quite aligned, but to some extent. We see here the URN of the letter, so the object that we're being annotating. The type, okay, it's creative work, and the vocabulary that the term creative work refers to. Okay, this goes well. The next element shows the correspondence. So again, a URN, creative work. The property is part of, shows that the letter is part of the correspondence, and so on. The pages, the notes, and the paragraphs of the edition. And the result of that is an RDF graph, which I won't go into detail, but this is the information that the annotation tool gets in order to be able to create the annotations. Annotatable types, well, in the simple ontology, that's very simple, of course, because there's not that much to specify. We have now included 3 annotation types about the text, about the content, about the text, that's about the content, about the pages, and about the editorial enrichment. Yep. But of course, if you have an extended ontology, you can also create extended specific annotation types, like for instance, an annotation type about the illustrations or about the bibliographical items or whatever you have. So that's it, more or less. For scholarly purposes, annotation of web pages is pointless. Well, that's a bit strong, but what you want to annotate is not the web page, but you want to annotate the underlying structure, which has a certain stability. Generic tools should do that, and that requires, if you want to do that, you need a protocol in order to facilitate communication. One way of doing that is to create this ontology and to embed RDF in the HTML. This way you can also describe the suitable annotation types. And I think while working on this, we realized this must be something that is really in common with very many other domains that need annotation. And perhaps it might be useful even beyond the domain of annotation. So, thank you.
We have 1 minute for questions while Claudia gets set up here.
Okay.
Have you thought about, or maybe I missed this, using scholarly HTML as sort of a basis for doing this? Have you thought about using scholarly, or are you using scholarly HTML, Peter Rust's thing, as the basis for the markup structure that you're using, or is this?
Our basis is that we use existing editions, so we don't want to prescribe to the edition. You have to use this sort of markup. It's what we want to suggest is to add some things to the existing markup in order to make the tool being able to talk with it. But we don't want to change the markup all over. I'm not sure whether that would be required in that case.